across generations. And so when I was doing my dissertation work, well, before I started my dissertation work, the big question is what do you want to research? What do you want to study? And for me, I knew I wanted to do my research within my own Pueblo community. One, because there had not been any research prior to my dissertation done by a tribal member, Tamaya Mehanu. Um, so I'm actually the first person in my Pueblo to receive a PhD. And knowing that, I wanted to make sure that my breadth of work or research would be contributed back to the Pueblo. And I also see this as a lot of foundational work in regards to building on future research projects or future initiatives, and wanted to give something back to my community. So before we begin, I did introduce myself earlier, but I also start with my positionality in a lot of my research and presentations. I am intertribal, and so not only am I from Tamaya, Santa Ana Pueblo, I'm also Zoha, which is Yuchi, Muskoki, and Shawnee. And so my parents, I share they met at Haskell University, which has its own history. So my mom and my dad met at Haskell. I'm a mother, I'm an auntie, a daughter, and a granddaughter. So on the right-hand side, you'll see I have my picture of myself when I was probably about 6 years old, and a picture with my family when I first got my bachelor's degree, and then my grandmother, and then I'm also learning how to garden. I've been gardening for about 5 years now since the pandemic, and foraging in terms of learning about our vegetation and different medicinal medicines from my auntie that exists within our Pueblo. My aunties are really esteemed embroiderers, so learning from them. And I love to dance, not only within the Pueblo, but I also like to shake shells within the Yuchi Muskoki ceremonial grounds. And I Zumba for fun, like salsa dancing and soca music. And so recently I joined the University of New Mexico Native American Studies Department as assistant professor. So I'm completing my first year in teaching. And prior to that, I have about 15 years in Native education, working with tribal ed departments, working with school districts, state government, nonprofits, and higher ed. And not only doing that within the field, but also being a researcher and evaluator within the field as well. So, to get into it, this quote has really stood out to me in many, many ways. And I call it the my view on education. That's how I interpretate the quote. But it's Pueblo leaders would master the new language and procedures that they needed to conduct the Pueblo's business with Americana officials. Accepting these necessary or desirable changes, however, would not alter the fact that they were the Hanu, the people. And for me, it really meant that we engage in schooling, higher education. We're engaging in these ways of learning to learn skill sets and tools in regards of how do we navigate this settler society, U.S. society, but however, learning these skills, learning these tools doesn't necessarily alter who we are at our core. And so for me, I wanted to focus my research again on teaching and learning in the concepts of how we learn and how teaching occurs within our Pueblo, but also understanding that our children and even us have had to navigate Western schooling, American schooling. So in the beginning of my dissertation, I really situated in among like Pueblo people, governance, and education. So I'm combining these three different concepts as they're interrelated to each other. And so for me, I feel like governance, education, belonging, go hand in hand in our communities through oral traditions, through community work and care. We learn a lot of our roles through um, family roles, whether if we're the oldest daughter, the youngest daughter, maybe the only son, we learn our different roles in our families, and we also execute these roles or participate in these roles during our feast days. Um, really colonialism really disrupted our our kinship systems, our family systems, our Pueblo systems. And then I also throw governance in there because through our history as Pueblo people, we can go back to the Pueblo Revolt when the Spanish came into this area. We can go into the Mexican government. But really, in this US society, we weren't really, I guess, defined as Pueblo Indians until after the US versus Sandoval court case, which had nothing to do with us. It had, to do with a liquor sale on our lands. But I include that kind of case law history in my dissertation to demonstrate that, as we were maintaining who we were as Han or Pueblo people, on the other side, there's this political history that's occurring that will impact us in our futures and currently now. And so we look at our Pueblo families resisting boarding schools as the U.S. Encroaches on our communities and even affecting us today in the Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit as well. And so really thinking about Pueblo reforms and what does that look like for our education and also talking about belonging. So I hope I didn't lose you, but I'm trying to come to talk through all of these different concepts in my dissertation. And so I believe by the end of this talk, it'll make more sense. Again, my literature, it really reviews concepts of teaching from the heart, Pueblo pedagogies of resistance. So I do talk through the historical context of assimilation, Pueblo resistance, and also like these beautiful learning spaces that are taking place at Santa Fe Indian School or Caris Language Learning Center, or even there's some public school sites as well as Bernalillo Public Schools where there's some amazing educators and directors really working to transform what schooling looks like and talking through applications of Indigenous models of community-rooted education models, again, like the KCLC, which, speaks to teaching from the heart, and then also the dissertation study itself of in what are teaching and learning concepts within Thamaya that are governed by like our sovereignty, our language, cultural values, and really just learning grounded in land, language, and love. So in my work, in my dissertation, I weave a lot of personal narratives, personal stories of that I've been able to reflect on how I learned like the core values that guide me as an educator, as a researcher, as evaluator, as a Pueblo mom. And so I'm weaving these stories throughout these different conceptual frameworks and theories. In conclusion, I think about education as love, as resistance and belonging, and thinking about grounding it in Pueblo values and intergenerational knowledge. Um, and again, citing, a good dissertation always asking you, what is the problem? Like, so that, I mean, I could debate that in regards because when I've been teaching my student, I was like, there's always that quote unquote scientific method, right? What is the issue? What is the problem? What is your research? And so when I was thinking about this, I was really thinking about what has disrupted, my ability to be like a first language learner, what has disrupted like my ability to participate fully in my Pueblo and learn pottery, learn embroidery, learn cooking as a child. And really it is the settler colonial systems, Indian boarding school, the way that we were viewed as Pueblo people, how we were defined as Pueblo people in the court case, Sandoval, U.S. schooling has really disrupted my my personal learning of Pueblo knowledge and developing my identity, which my family did a beautiful job, but also I found myself like the term code switching throughout my whole schooling. And, I could see my peers doing the same. Some people call it code switching, and some people call it situational appropriateness, but it's still the same thing. It's still asking you to be palatable in different spaces to be quote unquote successful. And so again, there's um, this legacy of education has become a tool of assimilation, eroding cultural continuing and self-determination. So my whole intention for the dissertation was to understand how Tamayamet across three generations experienced transmission of knowledge, language, values through culturally grounded educational practices. And and also um, looking at other educational frameworks, I purposely wanted to look at Pueblo frameworks and methodologies. And I'm really excited about this section in my dissertation because when I started my undergrad journey, I, I wasn't able to pull up on Pueblo scholarship. And so it's really exciting for me to have this chart and have it listed through with different Pueblo frameworks and scholars and areas that they have focused on. And so I really engaged with the deep sovereignty framework that came from Santa Clara Pueblo through Dr. Enos. Storytelling as method is highlighted and also Santa Clara Pueblo with Dr. Naranjo, home-based methodology, and thinking about how are home built, how are homes situated, where do like who cares for the home in that regard and what is the history behind that with Dr. Lorenzo coming out of Laguna Pueblo and also Dana attaching your heart theory and working with our youth and how do we you know, working with youth programming, but also there's an educational learning component to that too as well with Dr. Chosa Hamas. And then we have a Pueblo values framework developed by Dr. Swinson out of Santa Clara, recruitment as ceremony with Dr. Tenorio, observational learning models with Dr. Romero and Dr. Swina and talking through what are the different ways that our Koki relatives learn within their communities and what is their giftedness and what does that look like. Um, spiderweb methodology, Dr. Castro speaks about that in her dissertation as well. And then how do we approach community dialogues, think tanks, and in regards of designing and planning for our youth with the Leadership Institute and Dr. Human and Pueblo data sovereignty. What does that look like in education and not only for our Pueblos with Dr. Suina and Dr. Chosa? So I really draw on all of these frameworks when I was thinking through and designing my dissertation research. Now, before I go into the actual dissertation research, I'm going to kind of speak a little bit fast, but um, being younger scholar, a Pueblo woman, particularly for my Pueblo, women do not sit in roles in council. And so for me, I had to take that into consideration when I was designing my dissertation work and how would that look like and how would I approach it in a culturally respectable way. And so one thing is I grew up around my oral governance system since I've been a child, and I talk about that in my dissertation about what that looked like as a young woman and what that looks like now as a mother and as an auntie, and how do I engage in my governance system within the Pueblo. And so I pulled from a book by Floyd Montoya that was a historian for a Pueblo. He talks about the governance structure. And so I put this chart together and how do I explain what our oral governance looks like. So for me, we have our emergent story on the top where we emerged from Shipap and we had our Jaimuni Draikaj, our Matsawi, our Uyawis, and our Gochanis that were our original governance system. And then on the bottom, we have what we do have a oral governance system, but it was more, you know, implied, well, I don't want to say implied, but it was an adaptation to our governing systems to incorporate how do we have dealings with whether it was the Spanish, Mexican, or the US. So we have a history of adaptations to our oral governance systems where we have our governor, which is our tapo de our lieutenant governor, our mayor, which is a Spanish term mayordomo, and our capitan and our pescados, which are our sheriffs and church officials. And so today, this is what our governing structure looks like. And as a researcher, I have to practice like reflexivity on how do I not only being a member of the Pueblo and rooted here, but also a researcher and evaluator. So I had to really think about that. Um, my my institution that I graduated from was Arizona State University, and they do have a history of a lawsuit with the Havasu Pai tribe and the Arizona Board of Regents. I won't go into details, and it's an extensive history you can Google, but learning about this case study or learning about this case law, I wanted to approach my research in my Pueblo very thoughtfully, very ethically, and this lends to developing a ad hoc IRB within my Pueblo. And so this was learning about this case law made me think more like how am I going to approach research within my own community? So in thinking through that, I talk about Tamaya relationality, and this is how I approached my IRB within my Pueblo, knowing that I was going to do my research within my Pueblo. As I showed you the structure, no women sit currently on our tribal council, but that does not mean that women don't engage in our governance structure. But being a younger person, a researcher, I was personally overwhelmed by the thought of having to present to council, not being fluent in the language as well. And so I went to my mom's house and I was explaining to her, like, I have to, do research and I have to go through an IRB process, but the public does not have an IRB process. And I want to make sure that the research that I do within the Pueblo is has validity. I'm sorry, I can't say that word right now. Is valid. Um, and I also want to make sure that I go through the proper channels that way that my research is respected and has integrity by the Pueblo. And so I was very emotional, sitting at the table with my mom and my mom, I'm a first generational graduate too, so she doesn't really always understand all the things that I have to navigate. And she just, as mothers do, gave me comforting sentiments and told me you already have the answers within you. Like you have to trust your journey. You've accomplished things within the Pueblo through ceremony. You've accomplished things outside of the community. So trust in those gifts. And I was on my way and I would came back to my office here at my home and I was sitting here looking at my bookcase trying to find the answer, trying to find the theory, right? And I found my high school poetry book from my high school that published and read a poem. And I was like, this is what she's talking about. I have to approach this as research as ceremony, as that theory, and what does that look like within a Pueblo framework? And so for me, it was really rooted in my family, my kinship. I went back to my mom and I said, I need you to go on this journey with me. Because you've been on every single journey with me as my mother, whether it was ceremony, and teaching me how to navigate different learning spaces within our Pueblo. I need you to help me, asked her if she could help me in how to navigate this journey in approaching research within our Pueblo. And so she came with me to meet with our governor. And as protocol within our Pueblo, she spoke on my behalf as her child, asking the governor to, asking him if he could assist me in what I was pursuing. And then she turned it over to me, and I had to learn proper protocol of how to address him. This is honestly the first time I've had a one-on-one meeting with the governor that wasn't related to um, other departments or other work that I was engaging in. And so it did feel overwhelming, but it also felt very powerful and good at the time. And so I was sitting in his office and looking at all the things around in his office. And, after she finished and, I asked him for help and he agreed. He accepted me that he would go on this journey with me and, gave me a prayer of encouragement and how to communicate with him throughout the next couple years, which felt so amazing. Later on, um, I was thinking, do I have to present to council? But it's not that I didn't want to present to council. I wanted to make sure that people had more time to look over the work that I was doing. So I approached it like a dissertation committee, but I recruited people within my Pueblo that are really highly regarded and respected. And so I had to practice proper protocol and visiting them and asking them to help me. And so I ended up developing a Pueblo advisory committee. And for me, this advisory committee was, they were vetted by our leadership. There was agreements like MOAs that I had to develop between our governor and the committee that I was bringing on. To me, these were my spokespeople within the Pueblo that they were going to look over my research and provide me advice. And to me, this is really affirming like the Maya relationality and how we approach research and what is it going to look like. And again, the whole purpose in my dissertation, developing a Pueblo IRB and calling it Pueblo kitchen table theory. Again, creating a Tamaya-based IRB rooted in our Pueblo values, our oral governance, and relational accountability. It began at my mother's kitchen table, literally. Um, the framework centers relationality, consent, ceremony, and community mentorship. And the advisory committee, we had face-to-face visits. They're elders for me, they're educators, they're cultural leaders. And again, the next step for me is getting this approach adopted through our, um, as a resolution. So that's next steps for me. This is kind of what the advisory committee looked like. It was a representative, a Pueblo governor, a Pueblo war chief, a community member who was a retired educator and sat on our business boards, and also a woman who also was a Keres language teacher. So to me, these four individuals actually represent, Pueblo PhDs in my community, and I felt really good and confident in them overlooking my research. So it was like two different vetting systems, a community vetting system and then the dissertation committee. So for my research design, again, the IRB was collaborative. I had the advisory committee and they looked over my questions, my protocols. They gave me advice. They talked about ethics and prayer and kinship and who we are as Samaya people. And again, my IRB was approved through ASU. It had the cultural review process. So the IRB served as the cultural review process that exists with ASU. So jumping into the dissertation, I had 15 individuals from Santa Ana Pueblo who I interviewed, and they represented three generations, the youth 18 to 25, parents 26 to 59, and elder. The youngest participant that I had was 24, and the oldest participant that I had was 78 years old. And I recruited them using like a snowing ball method. I put up, sent out flyers, emails, individuals referred. Even my advisory committee helped me recruit. And I wanted to do more interviews, but I had to find a pause. And so I'm looking forward to picking it back up. Again, all participants self-identified as having lived experience in teaching and learning within Tamaya is voluntary. We did oral and written consent, and again, shared their transcriptions, and we ended up just doing, well, I ended up doing de-identification process and just identifying them through age and generational. So these were my interview questions, 4 interview questions. How was your learning experience growing up in the Pueblo? How was that teaching delivered to you? What is the important for children and youth to learn the language and culture, and how can the community support children and youth in this learning? So I think the longest interview that I had was probably like an hour and a half, and it was very I felt very blessed and honored and privileged to have listened to a lot of these stories and narratives and life stories, and even learned, even myself, some things that I did not know. And it made me realize the amazing body of like teaching and learning that exists within our Pueblo that's not taking place in like in a school building or a classroom. It's like it's in our community. It's in homes. It's in, our yards, the fields. It's in our traditional buildings. It's in the canyons, the river, and the mountains. And so it was, like I said, I haven't had a lot of time to reflect because I defended in July, so I'm still processing what I experienced, and I'm just excited to do more data analysis beyond my dissertation as well. Um, Sorry, let me skip over that. So, in doing my data analysis, I used the thematic coding, and I really was looking at this image that I developed on my iPad. I was drawing and really thinking about, the corn. Um, I love observing the clouds in our relationship to the clouds in terms of dancing for rain and what the rain does for our lands. And again, even observing the power of our sun and what that means to us. And so through this coding, I was looking at intergenerational knowledge, like family teachings, oral stories, and shared responsibilities. I was looking at cultural continuing, and what that means for the connection to the land, ceremony, and traditional roles, transmission of language, immersion practices that happen within our community, ceremonial language, language teaching, and even the transmission of language of what has disrupted that as well. I had some participants address this as address that as well. Transmission is values, thinking about how our values are developed, respect, reciprocity, humility, moral teachings, community visions, also like looking to the future and yes, we can talk about our experiences of how we learned or how we learned our roles, but also what does that mean for not only our children, but our future children that are still yet to be born, and thinking about core values, experiential learning, or future goals. So I'll spend a little time here. It's this again, there's to keep the
You.
to keep
Thank you.
to protect their identity and their autonomy. I didn't put the demographics or anything when I present on the findings, but these were some of the codes that I came up, so they're not in a particular order anyway. But with intergenerational knowledge, one of the ones that stands up to me is again, learning by observing grandparents and aunts, learning dancing from grandma and now teaching their daughter. So you can clearly see like it's intergenerational. She identifies her teacher. There's a process on what that looks like, cultural continuing, traditional responsibilities of women through the Maya life, reconnecting through post-pandemic ceremony. There's a participant that said that, shared that the pandemic really took a toll on them, and they were so excited in the previous years to start dancing and participating in ceremony and being around community. So I think that's a finding in itself, as well, how the pandemic has impacted not only our children's teaching and learning, but even our community as well. Transmission of language. They spoke about language classes help, but sometimes they feel uncomfortable. Others said they are encouraged by their peers. So I believe that was one of the younger participants that said that they're all learning the language together, and knowing that they were in Keres language classes, they make it a point to speak in Keres when they're around each other as much as they can. So I thought that was really amazing, and it speaks to the impact that the Keres languages classes are having in our community. Transmissions of values. Um, Again, learning values by doing, unity and responsibility emphasized. So they said the value is not just in saying you need to be respectful, but actually doing it, or having responsibilities is by learning it by actually doing it in our families and our communities. Um, People also demonstrated that they serve as role models for the youth, and what does that look like? That means something to them. Dancing teaches unity and sincerity, meaning like you're dancing with your whole community, and there's someone drumming, and there's singers, there's dancers, and there's people praying why you dance, and so that teaches us how to be in relationship with each other. Um, so Sorry, I'm moving. I can see your faces and I have to move you to the other side. Core values through educational experiences. So again, education is shaped by patience and child readiness. So there's observation on when children are ready to learn. And also our migration story. There was a participant that talked about going on our original migration route, like as a experiential learning when they were engaging in the Keres language classes, that they went on the original route and went to every site that our people situated in and learned about that history and what it meant. Um, Other people talked about how they learn through observation or watching others within our traditional buildings on how protocols or how to conduct like etiquettes and what does that look like. So there's quite a bit here. I can't go through all of it, but here's another, because it was 15 interviews. One of my favorite ones was like summers in Ribahani with grandma. Um, we have sub villages within our Pueblo. So in some of these respondents, there's talking about particular places and spaces within our Pueblo. And for me, I grew up in a sub community called Ranchitos. And so that specific place in this village has a dear place in my heart and how I learned. And it was really enlightening to hear other stories about other sub villages and their relationship. They talked about relationships to the land, to the river, or hunting in our bosque. And I hate to say it now, but our bosque is really dry, and it doesn't have a lot of the vegetation or some of the animals that existed at some point in time. And so we also have, again, learning and listening and being silent, or talking about ceremony and how it supports, how we process grief and how we release like tension or stress in our bodies, or healing. So again, I won't go through everything. Oh, shoot, apologize. So the question one, how is knowledge transmitted through intergenerationally? And these were the themes that came out: intergenerational knowledge, cultural continuing, language transmission. These were some of the big takeaways. Learning by observing, participation in doing, cultural continuing, ceremonial cycles, repetition, seasonal obligations, and learning, learning transmission, caris pass through emotion, memory, elder mentoring. There's barriers, but there's healing that occurs not only from individuals who are learning the language as a second language, but there's healing in that. And so those were some of the big takeaways from the findings. For the question two, what values guide education and how is the future envisioned? Again, core values, respect, reciprocity, humility, responsibility, um, modeled through action and not instruction. So a lot of people talked about how these values are lived, they're demonstrated, they're seen in our actions. They're not just like we don't just list our values, we actually live them, and that's takes place within our Pueblo. Educational practices like watching, listening, participating, not this was a I felt like this was a huge generational thing. So our parent generation, our elder generation, they said when they were learning growing up that they were always told not to ask questions, like don't be asking questions or I felt like that was a really generational response versus the youth that I interviewed said they were encouraged to ask the questions, the why, to explain why we do um like why our ceremonies exist or to how do you say something in Keras. And so I thought that was a huge generational shift because I grew up in the generation of just observed, don't ask questions, or if you're going to ask a question, wait till an appropriate time to ask a question. So I felt for me that stuck out in my head because of my own experience and how I learned. Again, we talked about futures, community visions, and they talked about home-based and land-based learning. They would like to see more of that in inclusive of language programs, more intergenerational language programs. And then the youth return pathways, meaning that how do we create not just programs, but even just our demeanor of helping our youth to be present in our ceremonies if they go away to college or they maybe are working away from the village. How do we encourage them to continue to practice and be who they are? And then, people were thinking about leadership in terms of I don't, I put redefine, but really they were thinking about not necessarily the title of leadership, but how do we practice leadership amongst our generations? So recommendations from the interviews, again, going more in depth, supporting intergenerational mentorship, like pairing elders and youth together, expanding language learning, like um, as language scholars know that sometimes language spaces aren't always safe, and I think that lends to intergenerational concepts of instruction. And so, some folks felt like the Keras language classes were not safe for them, and others felt like they learned a lot from the language classes. And so I feel like this is um, it was a space for them to voice their perspective. And also I asked them like what would make those spaces feel more safe. And they talked about the mentorship. They talked about the multi model care spaces, like our language classes shouldn't just be in a building. We should have them on the land. We should have them in different spaces or places of the home, whether it's the kitchen, whether it's the living room, whether it's singing. and basically saying like our Pueblo is the classroom, recognizing cultural educators. So again, just acknowledging who they learn from, whether it was like their aunties, their uncles, or informer teachers, was seen as people who cared for them and took care of them in the community. Again, the youth return pathways was really stuck out, and it was really because the youth are wanting to learn more and not be disconnected and offer support and also support for youth living away. Because I think the youth are connected to each other and they know that youth who are not living here or living away or missing home, or if they didn't grow up here, they're wanting to learn more about who they are and their identity and how do they contribute to the community and what does that look like. Again, these values need to be embedded in our governance, and our governance is not just our leaders, but our people collectively. So thinking about how do we embed our core values as the Mayamet in our policies? Again, infuse policy with humility, reciprocity, and shared responsibility. So meaning that everyone wants to contribute to the perseverance of the Maya and making it a well place to be and live, and what does that mean for the future. And so I'm excited to do more research in this area, like not only continuing to analyze my data, but also get to follow up with some more interviews that I just didn't have the opportunity to finish in my timeline. But I do feel like this research does center oral traditions and for the future, for future research. And I do want to do research like not only with storytelling, but also with Pueblo farming or different other concepts that will lead to to healing as well. So, implications again, invest in elder youth mentorship, feast day education, cultural roles, contributions, developing a Pueblo method in action, future work, again, expanding to language, food, land. I also want to talk about Pueblo data governance a little bit more. Um, Again, the study limitations, it only gives us a very snapshot into Tamaya learning and teaching. It doesn't encompass the full community at large, and there's very diverse perspectives from generation to generation and from family to family. But and then also in doing the interviews, there was some maybe not everyone wanted to answer the questions fully. I will say, like, it was very moving to see people try to go back into their memory bank, especially the elders, to go back in their memory bank and think about how did they learn the knowledge that they carry now? How are they passing down the knowledge? And again, it seemed, again, they may not have recalled everything in that moment of our interview, so I actually wanted to go back and do more interviews. And then also I'm from the Pueblo, so sometimes I think like maybe they may have felt more comfortable sharing their narratives and stories, or maybe they didn't want to share specific things. So I think I have to acknowledge those as limitations as well. When you're a researcher from your own community, you're wearing a lot of hats. So I want to stop there. I did go through a lot and I tried to go through it fast, but just thank you for allowing me to share my work today and my research. And I'm still, again, like I said, processing the journey, the research, the data, the stories that were collected and still sitting with me. But I appreciate this time to share like where I am at today. And yeah.